Good afternoon, everyone. We are here for our first panel of the afternoon. But let's just thank the Creator for what we have seen and heard, experienced so far. Let's just thank the Creator with some hand claps. Amen. Amen. This room has amazing acoustics, so we won't have to use the mics too tough. So we are going to have our first panel. We thank Pastor Amy Butler for that wonderful message. And now we're going to get into talking a little bit about the art and then later on the craft of preaching. And again, we don't lift these topics to suggest that you don't know what they mean, but to have a deeper, a broader conversation about them as relates to compelling preaching as we are launching this program that will allow us to dive deeper into these kinds of subject matters. So we have our wonderful panelists. So I'm going to allow each of them to share their name and their context, and then we're going to get into the conversation.
I'm Reverend Brandon Harris. I'm the Associate Dean for Religious and Spiritual Life at the University of Southern California.
My name is Rabbi Susan Goldberg, and I'm the founding rabbi of Nefesh, which is an independent spiritual community on LA's east side. Before that, I was at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and before that at Temple Beth Israel in Highland Park.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Fouad Elgohari, and I am an imam in the Southern California region in Orange County for the Majlis community, which is an initiative for Muslims in the area, building and cultivating community on the basis of love and service. I also serve as a part-time faculty with a variety of different seminaries here and throughout the world, and it's a privilege to be here with all of you.
Wonderful, thank you. We want to start this panel with just this simple, well, it may not be simple, but this simple question, which is if you could define for us what the art of preaching or sermon making looks like, sounds like, or is in your context. So I'll start with you, Imam. Give some people some.
Yeah. So there's a verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or God Almighty, says, وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ مِمَّنْ دَعَا إِلَى اللَّهِ. What is more beautiful than calling to God? And in a sense, just that very little passage gives us so much within our own tradition in terms of how we think about preaching. Oftentimes I'll use the word preaching from a technical sense with my community, and they'll almost immediately be turned off. And then I'll flip that and say calling, or just use the Arabic, in fact, dua or da'a, which is the idea of calling out or inviting people to something. And it seems like that idea of just simply talking about it in a way where you're including people, that there's a give and take, that you yourself as someone who is speaking on the mic are receiving from those who you're speaking to in as much as you're trying to give to them, really is capturing the essence of what inviting to the way of God is all about. And ultimately, preaching for us as Muslims is really about inviting people to the way of God. And within that, particularly within the verse, he says to do it in a beautiful manner. So there's an implication there to say that when you do that, when you speak in that way, ultimately what you're doing is capturing beauty in the world. And as one of our teachers would say, beauty is the splendor of truth. And so if you're speaking truth, ultimately you're capturing what is beautiful. And that ultimately will capture the heart of someone who is hearing from you and receiving it.
Wonderful, thank you. Heidi?
I want to appreciate you, Reverend Amy, for your words, and part of your opening that was so meaningful was saying that you love this. You love preaching and to be in a group of people who are committed to what it means to offer teachings that are compelling. I'm with you. I love it as well. I love it so much, and I don't have a lot of opportunity to think about the art and the craft. And it's also really interesting to me to hear your perspective as a Christian and the ways that it resonates and also the ways that it's different. The framework is different. We connect our teachings to Torah, and for us it's in a cycle It's in a cycle of a year. And each week there is a weekly prodding, nudging towards the divine. And our rabbis tell us that that the act of engaging, and there's at least 70 openings, the word might be interpretations, but there's at least 70 openings in every single line of the Bible, in every verse, in every pasuk. There's at least 70, meaning that it's upon us to get in there and find it. And the other thing about the Jewish perspective around being Bnei Yisrael, and Jacob becomes Yisrael when he wrestles with the Ish, which is said to be an angel, but the text says Ish, which means a man. Could be Esau, it could be himself, it could be all kinds of things. But that what we do also as Jewish people is wrestle, is to step inside, like each week, this practice is stepping inside that portion of our sacred text and looking around and wrestling. And it's one of the things that you, I feel, can feel when somebody shares a teaching, is how much have they personally wrestled in this place. Because you can tell when people are describing the experience or have been inside and have wrestled with the divine, with humans, with ourselves. And so that's the context.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brandon.
I think to join you in a piece of that, Rabbi, for me, out of the Christian tradition, preaching is incarnational. The idea for Christians, if Jesus is the Word made flesh, then our preaching must take on flesh, and that it cannot be disembodied. Words that sort of go out there but have nothing to do with people's actual lives. So for me, preaching is about listening to the world around us. It means sitting in the coffee shop. It means listening to the stories of my students. It means walking down the block. It means noticing the homeless person on the train. It's looking around this room and realizing that every person has a story here. And wondering, what does this text have to say to the lived realities of its hearers? And if Jesus is the Word made flesh, how does Jesus become embodied in that person's life? How does that become sort of a place of hope, but not only a place of hope, but how can they take that out and it actually means something to them? And for me, I think the great crisis of preaching right now is that it is disembodied, and that we've forgotten that preaching must take on flesh. It has to be earthy, it has to be grounded, it has to be lived within people's lives. And so, yeah, I think taking on that incarnational approach to preaching is important within my own tradition.
That's good. Thank you. I have this definition here. It's not mine, but it's a definition that I've looked at often. It says the art of preaching or sermon making lies in the ability not only to make the words speak, but in the ability to make words sing, to make words cry and laugh, and to make them leap. So my next question is, so that's just a definition. But I'd love to each of you share with us how you approach the art in your sermon making, your preaching. How do you approach the art as it relates to message preparation? Yep.
Yeah, so the art of preaching for me begins with the text and wrestling with the particular narrative. What did it mean to those in its context? What was its history, its location, the story, the feeling, the emotions behind those who would have heard these words the first time? Of course, all the technical elements, right, of parsing through whatever Greek and Hebrew, but not staying there, but then moving into the lives of those that I'm preaching to. That means walking around the space. That means, again, walking around my community. I try to write my sermons in a public space. I don't want to be in my office because I want to look at some random stranger in the coffee shop and go, what would this word say to this person? How would they hear this? Would this mean anything to their lives? Rather than being cloistered within my office, and again, being disembodied from the lived realities of people around me. And then preaching to myself, right? As has already been said, if it doesn't live with us, it won't live with our people. And so I think taking that space, wrestling. The last piece I'll add with this, I'm a Baptist preacher, y'all. It takes us 20 minutes to clear our throats. But the last piece is not just listening to the text and the world around me, but it's also drawing from deep wells and other resources. So it means reading outside of my own tradition, right? I will never preach the life of Moses without quoting the works of, for example, Jewish psychotherapist Aviva Zornberg. It means reading psychology. It means reading history. It means reading poetry. It means opening up the LA Times. It means reading the New York Times. It means going on TikTok. I learned stand on business from my students, right? It means listening to the world around us, again, so that preaching takes on flesh. It means listening to those little snippets of conversation that you hear in the church hallways. Sister such and such did what? They can't pay what bill? They're arguing about this. Listening to the stories of our people so that when we preach, again, we actually have a good word to give them.
That's good. Rabbi?
It's beautiful, very similar process. I start, because it's a cycle of the week. So after Shabbat, immediately is Yom Rishon, which is Sunday, and that's the day to study the parsha that's coming up for that week. So it begins with study, texts, commentary, study, and then what I describe what you just said is how does the world speak into that during the week? So that could be conversations, very much often with congregants, with family members, with what's in the news, what's happening in the world. How does it speak into? And then there's an issue of faith, right, around it. Like, wow, every week there has to be a sermon, what we call a Devar Torah, right? And so on Sunday, you're like, okay, I'm studying this, and I'm open to the world, but there has to be a sermon at the end of this. So how around Wednesday, that needs to be clear where it's headed, the theme. And usually in the study, the theme will be present. Because that's the other thing, right? We can't talk about everything every time. And one of the simplest things that I ever got taught in my rabbinic program by our Devar Torah, our sermon teacher, he said, after they come and hear you, then they walk out, and their friend who missed it walks up and says, what did the rabbi teach on? And that person has to be able to answer that question in one sentence. The rabbi spoke about speaking truth to power. The rabbi spoke about what does it mean to give from our hearts, give and receive. The rabbi spoke about whatever it is, it needs to be that clear. So for all of the study and the looking around and the stories, at some point, it has to be clear. And the clarity leads us both back into the narrative, so back into the poetic and the narrative, so because there's so much narrative, so it'll help us to focus on what part of the narrative we want to live into. And then it moves from story into action, which is part of what I was hearing you say, is that it's beautiful to tell stories, and the stories are what shape everything. Stories are what shape our lives, what shape our culture, what shape where we're headed in the future, what shapes the possibilities of the future are shaped by the stories we're telling now. So story is so important, and the stories have to lead us somewhere. So there's two pieces of that. What is the theme and the narrative, and what are the actions we're headed towards? And the last piece I'll add is that Rav Kook, who was a teacher, talked about this fourfold song. And he spoke about the different songs that some of us sing the song of the self, some of us sing the song of our people, some of us sing the song of humanity. So when I'm working on the sermon, I'm thinking about those four realms, which I call self. How do I want to help people's lives inside? How do I want to help their relationships one-on-one, the beloveds? That's a second song. The third song is the communal, and the fourth is the world around us. And a lot of spiritual communities have a lot of focus on self and not a lot of look at the world. And being raised in an incredibly beautiful radical social justice family, a lot of people have focus on the world and not a whole bunch of focus on the self. And so part of my commitment as a rabbi is I'm not giving up either. And people come needing both. They may be used to hearing one or the other, and that's more comfortable for them, self-growth or change in the world. And it's important. If you're making the world better, but you do not know how to talk to your partner or you're mean or nasty to your kids, that's not okay. So holding all of those together in a sermon.
That's wonderful.
MashaAllah. And I feel like so much has already been addressed, and in a sense, thinking about what you both have said, I almost feel like I could, from any angle, kind of share in those experiences, whether on a theoretical level, thinking about, the way in which we construct the actual sermon that we're going to be giving for us on Friday, and a very similar kind of experience, and kind of thinking about the week as it unfolds and how that brings me to that Friday to be able to say something to the congregants. Or on a very practical level, thinking about the delivery itself and how best to communicate this message to the people in a way that connects to their very real life experiences and also understands the context by which these matters apply. And I think almost in trying to complete this, and I would probably argue that you both have the ability to do this as well, is to think about it in terms of how it's animated. There's a verse in the Quran where God Almighty says, وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ. That they have not been instructed to do anything, and the they here, as a matter of fact, when you look at the exegesis on this, is actually speaking to the past dispensations. It was actually speaking to Ahlul Kitab, the people of the book, who we say are the Jews and the Christians. That they have not been instructed to do anything, and then the Muslims including themselves in that, except to worship God sincerely. That sincerity is actually at the heart of what animates these speeches. I was sitting actually with a group of young people, and we resonated, we vibed. It was like a 10-minute conversation, and someone came up to me afterwards and they told me, "You know why they liked you?" I said, "Why?" He said, "Because they could tell that you were being real." What is that exactly? I mean, how do you capture that? In a very sort of quantitative world that we live in today, it becomes really difficult to understand what that really means. But to me, at the heart of it is sincerity. That we have not been instructed to do anything as people of God in preaching this message except that we're being sincere. And to know that at the end of the day, you may say something that bedazzles the audience, but internally, where are you? And that matters, and it has to matter for people who recognize that there's a level of consciousness that we're all accountable to. They asked the Prophet's wife, peace and blessings be upon him, the Prophet Muhammad's wife, Aisha. They said, "What was the character of the Prophet like?" And she said, "Kana khuluquhu al-Qur'an." He was the walking Qur'an. In other words, if you want to read the text, you can read the text. But in the same way of embodiment, you can also read the individual. And what you see in the text will follow in that individual. That to me is the manifestation of sincerity in somebody who's really living the message that they're preaching.
That's beautiful. Thank you. One last question, because we want to open it up to a little Q&A from everyone. Give us a little bit about, so one of the things that I've learned is that we get better at this thing called preaching by also paying attention to others who are doing that work within our context, even sometimes even outside of that. What do you all see missing, or what do you think we could benefit of seeing more of as it relates to the art of preaching, that our sermons, our sermon making would be more compelling or compelling, period? What do you see missing, or what you recommend or would like to see more of? Whoever wants to jump in on that one. Brandon?
You're asking us if we have critique of, we're
not
all here
critique,
together.
Not critique, but just as you look at the landscape of messages, what do you see missing?
Yeah, I think that piece that I was sharing earlier about the inner outer, sometimes I go to hear, and I don't get to very much. That's the other thing. When we are giving, when we're congregational clergy, it's a very specific kind of role where we are on every week. So we don't always get to hear each other. And in fact, the places that I've gotten to hear you, Reverend Najuma, and others here have been in the streets, and you, Mike, When we get to do interfaith social justice work together, we get to hear each other, which is one of the blessings of doing that work, is learning from each other in the moment of taking action. But when I often hear, it's that place of either there is an issue that somebody's talking about, and to me, a political speech is not the same as a sermon. And so I think that's real. And then on the other side, people sharing stories of things that it doesn't feel like, from all the language that I think has been shared here, embodied, lived, sincere, it doesn't feel that it's in a place necessarily of somebody's lived experience. And I just want to say also, just to call out that when we share our lived experience, that's also tricky. To make sure that it's processed enough, right? Don't share anything that is not processed. That's just a heads up, because having that kind of vulnerability when you are not ready for it is not okay. And it's meaningful to be vulnerable when we are sharing with our communities. It's very meaningful. And I encourage that. But there's vulnerability, and then there's vulnerability. There's vulnerability that hasn't been held enough to be shared. If something's been held enough to be shared, then please share it. But and the other piece for those of us with kids is being very mindful about what we share about our kids or people in our lives without their permission. And that's and as they change age, the permission changes. It's like a whole period of where I'm right in with some early adolescence that's like, do not say anything about me. And before it was okay, and for my older one, it's okay again. So being able to share our real experiences in a way that's respectful for the people who are being shared about, and to be honest about what's hard. So part of what I do when I'm inside towards the end of we call it a Devar Torah or a drash, a teaching on the Torah, is whatever the message is, and this is probably a very Jewish thing to do, is to flip it, or to have the idea of what somebody in there is going, yeah, Rabbi, but what about? Or to say, what you have just said is hard. Don't make it sound easy. So then I'll also talk about why it's so hard, or what are the barriers to doing the thing that I just laid out as action to take, so that there is a sense of, it's not pithy. It's not like, oh yes, let's change. It's that change is hard. What are some of the barriers? And we still need to do it. And always and always and always and always and always is that it's about community, and that none of us are doing this by ourselves. And it's, I think, one of the main things that all of us are offering now that is such an important thing right now. I mean, America has always had a culture of individualism. It's part of, our capitalist death, whatever we're headed for. And we've also all been able to connect with each other through community. That's how we've made change, that's how we've grown, that's how we've loved. And the piece to keep coming back to is how the beauty and the growth of our spiritual lives happens together. Not solo, it happens together.
Wonderful. Thank you. Brandon?
Yeah, my Southern grandparents would say that, good meat makes its own gravy. And I think within my own tradition, we are dealing with the commercialization of the church. And we are so busy competing against one another, so worried about preaching not to our parishioners, but to what we think our colleagues want to hear, or to what we think will get us a big audience, what will make the room shout and hoop and holler. Within, again, my own tradition, what will get folks up on their feet and clapping and stomping? What will get folks to buy the book? What will get folks to tune into your church and to listen to your YouTube thing and your podcast? But what I think is, as Philip Brooks says, that if preaching is truth through personality, we have our own personalities, our congregations have their own unique gifts, and so how do we live into a text that will produce its own gravy? And give our people something that they can walk with through the week. And so often, I think we give something that feels good. It's like candy and it's sugary. But can I carry that throughout the week? Will that help at 3 o'clock in the morning when you've watched your loved one walk out? Will that help when your heart is broken? Will that help when you can't pay the bills the next day? Will that help when you're trying to deal with a fascist government? Will that help when the world is dealing with all sorts of injustices? We need something that will help people to live. And so I think we need preaching that will produce its own gravy. Live the text. Preach the text, walk through the text, because for over 2,000 years now, in our own tradition, the text has produced its own gravy. So stop fighting each other and preach the good news to your people.
Thank you, Brent. Imam?
Yeah, so again, to follow, it's like there are so many things that I feel like we could discuss here. To limit it to one thing, I would say, and ironically, it's to not limit the type of message that you're preaching.
That's good.
So to me, I think that we live in a time where reductionism, to use an academic term, the idea of limiting the way that we perceive reality to this one dimension has become the norm. And I would argue that in the pre-modern period, that definitely was not the norm. We recognized that there was diversity natural to the way that God created things, and we celebrated that diversity. Not in some perfunctory, superficial manner where I create a paradigm by which then subjugates you as someone who is different in society to have to meet those standards, but that I fully accept who you are. And I'm fully with you when you're speaking the truth that you have to speak. And in recognizing that, oftentimes, I'll look at the scholars of the past, one in which was a brilliant scholar of the Islamic tradition known as Ghazali. And Ghazali actually talks a lot about this idea of speaking to people in a way that is commensurate to the individual themselves, and recognizing these sort of natural patterns that God has created. In the past, you would use terms like you have a sanguine personality, you have a choleric personality, you have a melancholic personality, so on and so forth. But just recognizing that within our dispositions, we're different. And so there may be a individual within my community who, when I speak a message that is impactful and really speaks to the heart, but doesn't carry all that much substance, feels like he didn't really get all that much out of it. And so he comes and he challenges me a little bit. And I recognize that in a way that is endearing to him, that this is an individual who needs that give and take in order for him to really thrive with this message. Some maybe not. Some may not actually want to hear the message at all. They want to live the message. They want to be the message, and to also have something to offer them. And then obviously those who are really just coming to take something with them for the week, something small, but that ultimately hits the heart and allows them to move through the week in a way that's going to be palatable.
It's beautiful. Thank you. The three of you have offered such rich thoughts on the art of preaching. We want to offer to those of you that are part of our audience some little time for a Q&A. So if you have any questions or thoughts, just pop on up. Do we have any mics floating? Okay, well, we have great acoustics in here, so if you use your preacher voice, we can hear you. But if you have a question or a thought, we'd love to share that. So if you just want to stand and ask a question or have a thought you'd like to share, we want to allow you to do that this time. Go, yep. Just pop right on up, but speak loud. It's better.
I'm curious, and this may not be the right time to ask this question, but I'm curious if you're experimenting with the form of preaching in terms of discursive forms, if you've experimented with not talking to people, but talking with people, and how that has worked, and if you found any good resources for kind of making the sermon more of a conversation with the parishioners.
I think two pieces to that. My own study of homiletics, I think that the church has always tried to experiment with preaching, particularly in the 60s. There was the question, is preaching relevant, and trying to change the shape and form. I think that preaching as proclamation is still needed and necessary. and that there are other ways than to do discursive, sort of group-based work, right? So doing a sermon talk back. So in my congregation in DC, it was the most nerve-wracking thing, but after every Sunday, folks could ask me questions regarding my sermon, which was nerve-wracking, right? Because folks were like, why'd you say that? What text did you study? What seminary did you go to again? Right. Who are you? And especially the church mothers, boy, you ain't lived long enough yet, right? So I think, but creating other spaces, right? Wednesday night services, I think, are a great space of that more dialogical sort of engagement in preaching. But I personally am still beholden to the idea of Sunday morning. That traditional form of proclamation is really important. I would add that with the caveat of that I come from the Black church tradition, so preaching is naturally dialogical, and so if folks don't talk back to me, I'm nervous. That means I'm not preaching well. So, but having served in Euro-American context, I think that preaching also is dialogical within those congregations as well. It's paying attention to the head nod. It's paying attention to folks leaning forward. It's that slight shift. It's that comment at the door. And then I think it's taking that space outside of it and going, okay, let's talk about this after church. Maybe let's have a fellowship hour, a coffee hour, where we can explore this more together.
That's good.
Yeah, dialogic, is that the fancy term for that? Yeah, I like that. Definitely feel the head nods or the people grabbing somebody, like, I just told you that. You know, people will do that. I would like for them to say it out loud. I'm trying to figure out how to encourage them. What did you say? Say it louder for everybody to hear. We in the services, there's always a particular part at the beginning where I ask a question based on what the theme of the Devar Torah is going to be. So early on in the service, everybody has a moment to turn to a neighbor and discuss the theme together for an ample amount of time. So we've prayed a couple of prayers, and we're approaching the Shema prayer, which asks us to listen. And so before doing that, every time I put out the idea of the theme, and then I make a question based on the theme that everybody discusses together. And then the other piece, but it's true, I also do enjoy just the artistry of the moment of giving the sermon. And the other piece that we do is that our community, Nefesh, is filled with a lot of artists, including the musicians who are central to the making of the service. And so we work during the week to choose a song, a secular song, that is, because most of our prayer and liturgy is in Hebrew. So a secular song that's in English that's related to the theme. So right following the talk is music. Yeah.
Imam?
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, we try to find ways to diversify the types of worship that we do. So within, obviously, the Islamic tradition, you have the formal prayer, or the salah, which has its particular liturgical readings. Within the sermons, there are certain things that have to be done from kind of a legalistic perspective. There isn't much of a back and forth, although there will be times where, somebody might say something and people feel it and they say something back. I find that there's actually much more a cultural sort of understanding to that. There are certain, like for example here, the African American Muslim communities, you'll find that they have that very sort of natural dialogical experience with their sermons within the Muslim community. And not so much, let's say, with the primarily immigrant communities. I'm Egyptian by birth, and my culture also. I can also say that Egyptians have a tendency to speak during the sermons in that sense, right? So maybe it's Africa, I don't know. So there's so there's a diversity within the community, and you begin to see that people sort of tend towards whatever their culture and the norms around that culture allow. But then also, you see that there are different forms of worship within the Islamic tradition that we try to also appeal to. The idea of coming together in our community on Wednesdays, for example, and doing a lesson. The idea of studying and knowledge is central to the Islamic tradition. And I'll oftentimes leave an ample amount of time for a lot of back and forth within these classes. Then we also have a time where we come and we're not teaching anything. We're just coming to worship together in ways that are a bit more lax in terms of the legal responsibility. So just sitting in a circle, for example, and going through certain litanies, reciting the names of God, the attributes of God with each other in a very prescribed manner. So we begin to see that there's this sort of variety that we try to appeal to, and I think that our community really appreciates that.
Wonderful. Thank you for the question. Any other questions or thoughts? A gentleman here and then Elder Owens. Okay. Yes. Please give us your name and then use your... I think everybody was like, that's a good question. My initial thought to that is the heart, but we don't get to see that, right? Like that would be the place for me, is that the message, the sermon gets to the heart of the individual and the heart of the community and church. But I don't know if we have a visual for that. And if there is, we may not see it right away because sometimes a heart change takes time. So that's just my thought, but I'm going to let him answer too. Yeah.
Well, I'll piggyback off of that because I'm going to agree with you that it is the heart. And to me, that is the end goal, is that you've reached the heart. And, there's a story anecdotally that we have within our tradition. It's a brilliant scholar in the classical period, 11th century, 12th century, named Abdul Qadir Jilani from Jilan in Persia, Greater Day Persia. He ends up moving to Baghdad and becomes really this profound preacher in that region at that time. And he would garner thousands of attendees in Baghdad. And really at that time, Baghdad was sort of seen as like the hallmark of civilization in many ways. And his son, who was also a student of his, at a certain point in time, through his training, felt like he was ready to preach. And so he went to his father and said, "Father, I think I'm ready." And he told him, "You're not ready." And he said, "Well, I've been with you for X amount of years. I know myself. I know the tradition. I feel like I have the information that's needed in order for me to preach this message. Let me do it." And so he said, "That's fine. Go ahead and do it." And so he sat in the seat, began to preach. And when he was doing it, he noticed that people in the audience were yawning, some people falling asleep, people tuned out. And he didn't really understand. It got really awkward, actually, to the point that his father looked over at him and kind of said, wrap it up, keep it going, And so he finishes. His father then takes the seat and he begins to preach. And he preaches about a story. He says, I had such an awkward day. My wife, your mother, and he actually addressed the congregation by saying, your mother, i.e. his wife, came to my bedroom and she put down some chicken between the door. And she left the door a little bit open. And then a cat came, and the cat ate the chicken. And he looked at the audience, and everybody was crying. And so he looked over at his father, and he said, I don't know what's going on here. So they finish. He goes up to his father afterwards, and he says, what chicken, and what's going on here? He said, they understood the message. They understood that, in fact, the chicken was the heart. And that when you leave the door open to your heart, you're susceptible to evil coming in and taking pieces of your heart from you. That you could take the gnosis of God from your heart, that they could come and steal the sustenance that God has brought to you. That's what they could see from what it is that I was saying. In other words, they understood that this was actually an affair of the heart. That sometimes I can speak in a manner where I may not actually have all that much information, but for some reason, something about what this guy said was a little bit different. That's what we're really after.
There's a practice that I do at the end of the sermon in terms of what I thought you were going to with the sports analogies was where are we ending? And I do make a blessing at the end of every sermon that is based on where we just were in. The journey of the sermon needs to end with may you. And it's a blessing for the whole community. And the practice of doing that for me lands the teaching inside of the heart and what people can bring with them as a blessing.
Yeah, thank you. We have a sister here, and then we see you back there, Pastor. And I would add also, and I would say this as we were talking about it, and if Bishop Noel Jones was here, he would say the mind, because he's very much into the mind being a big part of transformation. So I also believe that there is some balance to that as well. But I think it's the heart. I don't know. Yes.
So he had his hand up after me.
It's
Hello,
okay.
everyone. My name is Precious Williams. It was something that our brother said. I'm currently in a PhD program in homiletics, and I'm curious from my Pentecostal background, your thoughts on spirit-filled preaching, because our brother said something to the extent of there's something different about this preaching. And so I'm curious of your thoughts from each perspective of the Spirit's role in preaching.
Yeah, go ahead, jump on in.
I'm a child of the Church of God in Christ, to all my Kojic folks. And I am still deeply neo-Pentecostal. And so I believe in deeply that all preaching should be spirit-filled preaching, at least within the Christian tradition, that you need to be guided by the direction and the listening to and an attunement to the Spirit, and to the ways and directions that the Spirit might guide you. And that might be enfleshed in different ways. That might be an insight that comes up in your sermon that you might not have before. In some traditions, right, that might be more extemporaneous preaching. Lately, in my own preaching, my preaching has shifted, where I do all of the exegetical work, I do all of the studying, but I don't preach with a manuscript anymore. I have been really clear about preaching with, again, doing all the textual study, all the exegesis, all of that, but trying to be guided in my preaching by the Spirit, with a direction, listening to the congregation in that moment, looking at how people are nodding, looking at how people, their body language, listening before service, getting there early enough so that I have a sense for the space and how people are feeling, the history of the space. As a black man entering into particularly white spaces, I pay attention to who has preached in this pulpit, who hasn't preached in this pulpit, whose voices, whose names have been lifted up, and then going wherever the Spirit might take you in that. And that doesn't necessarily have to embody itself in charismatic forms. Now, again, I'm a son of the Church of God in Christ. That might wind up in speaking in tongues and shouting and all of that. Or it might end in response. What is the response of the hearers? And I think all Spirit-guided preaching leads to a sense of change within the world, if it's truly Spirit-guided preaching.
That's good, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This has been a big part of my journey in coming to embrace how it is that I do approach. I'm getting so much great language. Thank you, Christian brothers and sisters. Spirit-guided, okay? Spirit-guided. I'm taking that with me. My process involves the study, the writing it all out, and then I don't read it. So it's there. The process of writing it is how I learn it. And then if I need to, I can look to know where I'm heading, but I do not read it. And that has always been, I have a background as an artist. I was a choreographer and dancer and theater maker, and really trust improvisational process. It's also key to jazz, right? You have to have skill at a certain level to be able to let it all go. And you have to have done the study and the wrestling and the connecting with God to be able to be ready to be an open bone and just pour through. But I was in that place, and then I came to a large temple where I was working, and they went through a process before the high holidays, which is the big time of the year, and they said that all of us had to read each other our sermons word for word a couple months ahead of time to give each other critique or ideas, right? And I was like, a couple months ahead of time, there's no way I'm ready. And I also don't write things word for word, but everybody there did. And I was new there, and I don't even know what I did in that first time where we were supposed to do that, but it went terribly. It was an awful experience. I said something, it wasn't even anything what I wanted to say, it was too early for me, it was not all in my process. And I was like, wow, I think I do this wrong. I think I, do this wrong. And then a very good friend who's a writer and an artist took me out that night and said, we don't want you to be like everyone, we want you to be like you, and this is what draws us. And she also is a writer in scripts and stuff, and talked very carefully in a critique about the way men tend to write sermons, scripts, all of it, based on Joseph Campbell and this hero's narrative that's super individualistic. We could talk about this. That's a whole other question about does being a woman affect how we preach, which I think is important to look at, and instead to look at more of a spiral that kind of opens and reveals, which is the approach. But after that experience of being, I had already been comfortable and then was totally questioned in it, and then it felt like I had to reaffirm, yes, you are all going to get in this huge, gorgeous sanctuary and read it word for word, and I am going to get up and not look at what I have written and trust that it will come through. Yeah.
Awesome. Imam, did you have anything you want to add to that? No? Okay. Yes, Elder Owens, and
Yes.
I think we have one more.
I just wanted to share, I grew up with Dr. Henry Mitchell. Some of you may have heard of him. He was the writer on black preaching. And I took a class right up here. This is in the late 70s when I first came into preaching. And one thing I learned from him that I try to teach is that we are to know something, and preaching is to make us do something. So he always talked about in his sermon, in sermon writing, not just points, but 3 what he called moves, motivations. And that you start off with a behavioral motivation. That is, when you look at this text, what does God want us to do as a result of this? And as the preacher, you should be thinking of that. Okay, now, to add this to this, what I really became enlightened with as I came to the Pentecostal church and I've learned more about preaching is that Jesus says, preach the gospel, which in the Christian context is the good news of Jesus. And 2 Peter 2:18 says, but grow in grace in the knowledge of Jesus. So it began to help me to know that whatever I'm preaching, whatever I'm speaking, I need to find out one revelation of the knowledge of Jesus. What's good about Jesus? What has he done for us? For example, God so loved the world that gave his only begotten Son. So if I'm preaching about that, I'm talking about how God loves us through Jesus. That's the main thing. Whatever else I'm doing, and then we're motivating people to do something. That scripture says to believe. So I'm motivating the people to believe that. And then in the black congregation that we've learned, Dr. Mitchell taught us that you need to celebrate. That is, in the praise and worship movement, we've learned we need to praise God. Thank you, Lord, for loving me. Thank you, Lord. I praise you. I love you. And then now you're at the place where you're going to say, okay, I think I'm going to love God. So that the whole preaching goes from knowing to doing. I found that to be the main way to help me as a preacher and to help the people get into it and move into it and then move toward God. What do you think about that?
He wants your reflections, the 3 of you.
Yeah, that piece of celebration, thank you for lifting that, Elder Owens. That's a really important piece, I think, of preaching in the black church tradition. I think the depth of that and what's been lost is that I think over the last 20, 30 years, folks focused on the celebration and the act of celebration at the end versus lifting up what comes beforehand. And so I think the importance of lifting up doubt and skepticism and questions and wrestling before you get to the celebration. And so oftentimes I will lift up with the congregation, like, I read this and I was like, Lord, this ain't make no sense. Do y'all feel that way? Have you felt that way? Have you wondered how you're gonna make it, right? And in the act of celebration, also going, your celebration may not always resolve everything. right? But I am celebrating the one who holds all things, right? And so I think leaving room and space for that celebration. There will always be, I think, within the black preaching tradition, it is not black preaching without celebration. It is a blues moan and a gospel shout. But the blues moan has to come first. And if we don't give room for the blues moan, the rest is wasted breath. And you're wasting your time, and you're running around and shouting, and yet our neighborhoods still look the same, our communities still look the same, and people are still left with the same problems.
Imam?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I really like that actually, the idea of, using the sermon almost as a catalyst to enlist action. The one thing that I would think about though is that action being both something that is physical, in other words, outward action, and then inward action. That there also has to be room for us to think about really beginning the conversation of one's state and how we as individuals, so much of what we do actually is a manifestation of our state. And either our tradition has something to say about spirituality and the way in which we sort of move through these different states, how to understand them and how to navigate them, which then provides us the type of manifestation of action that we're looking for, or we don't. And I would argue that, at least on this stage, for sure, there's a lot to say on those conversations. And I think it's important, particularly for the upcoming generation, that you say something about this internal reality that I'm constantly having to navigate. That this is not something that is simply left to the secular domain. Like there is a conversation that Jews, Christians, and Muslim scholars have had for thousands of years about what we would maybe term a kind of psycho-spiritual understanding of the self that has to be brought into the discourse. Yeah. So yes, outward action, but also inward. And the idea of outward action too, and I don't want to take away from the fact that this is an extremely important part of the sermon, and we want people to act. But at the same time, something in me feels like it's a product of our context and the time that we live, where we're constantly thinking about the action and what to do. I spend a lot of time in West Africa. My teacher actually lives in the Gambia. I go visit him there. And it's profound to see life in West Africa. Because so much of what we would assume the norms are in terms of how we collectively as a community look at success, like a successful day over a non-successful day, has to do with how much you've done. Yeah? Versus in these societies where they really bring you back to an understanding that, no, it's really about what you've done internally. Like you as an individual, who are you? Do you feel closer to that? And it's lost on us, particularly, I would say, in North America. And I hope that we can begin to sort of see this idea of the sermon enlisting action in both an outward manifestation and an inward.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful. And the idea of Sabbath is about being and not doing. And it's part of what I think is a healing offering that we all need, to have Sabbath, to have Shabbat, to have the not doing. And in fact, people think, oh, we work, and then we get to Shabbat or Sabbath to rest from the working, and it's like a collapse. Oh, I'm exhausted, now I'm going to rest. Rather than the being in holy spaces, the being with each other, the being in worship and prayer, that actually generates the week, rather than the other way around. And so there is the doing, and we're big on doing in our community, but it's where does it come from? Because doing without thoughtfulness or intentionality can cause harm. And so what is our intention in our doing? And that soul work could be growing something in ourselves. It could be changing how we relate to the people right in our houses. It can also be about serving the community. It could be about protest. There's just such a wide, and there's also want to be mindful of not judging what doing is better doing. And I also, it's funny because we're talking about the art of preaching, but I just want to say, it's important to say before we end that preaching alone is not enough. So I have experienced the contexts in which there was a community where I used to work where the sense was, I'm going to sit here for this amount of time and see what you are going to do to me. And then I'll evaluate how good of a job you did. Right? That's really different. That's part of the reason why I wanted to start a community, that we were going to all co-create and participate together. And so, yes, there are sermons in which we talk, but then there are classes. We do something called Musar, which is taking our deepest values shared by all traditions: compassion, love, faith, patience. And how do we practice those? So people are in Chavruta, they're in partnerships for accountability. We have small groups. We have classes and learning. It's not enough to just go, oh, okay, I'm going to sit here for this amount of time and then I'll evaluate how well you did. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for all of us to be growing. If the words help us to move, that's what we hope. But it's not just that alone. It's all during the week, and it's all during the year, and there's many ways that we can all do that together. There's inspiration, there's challenge, there's nudging that we can do, and we have to all be committed as a community to doing that work together.
That's good. Thank you. Let's give our panelists a big hand, shall we? As we conclude this panel, we're going to quickly move and shift to our second panel. So take about 3 minutes if you need to the restroom, get some fresh air. But we want to thank you, Imam. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Pastor. Thank you all. 3 minutes, stretch, and come back in for our second and closing panel for this afternoon. Every round is going higher and higher. Thank you. Blessings.